As you know, Term Plus recently came on as a platinum sponsor of Rask podcasts, and I invested a small amount myself, $2,000 to be exact, to get a feel for it. After all, I couldn't tell you to consider it if I hadn't at least considered it myself. And the result is it's a very, very good platform. It's potentially the simplest technology platform that I've come across in Australian finance. And what makes that extra special is, behind the scenes, something very sophisticated is actually happening. Term Plus is investing your capital in a globally diversified and professionally constructed portfolio of private credit designed to produce attractive and reliable monthly income. Aside from providing passive income, what really attracted me to partnering with Term Plus now is potentially falling interest rates. Because Term Plus starts by targeting 3% returns above the RBA cash rate for a 1-year fixed term account, there's a buffer in place even as interest rates fall. Monthly income can also be paid directly into your bank account or reinvested for compound returns. I see Term Plus as a really neatly packaged way for retirees or even accumulators like me to get exposure to professionally constructed global private credit portfolios. You can find out much more information and grab a hold of the PDS and TMD at termplus.com.au. If you want to just check out the website, you should also know that there's an instant chat function for questions, which is really important and I find really handy before I invest in anything. Don't forget to tell them Rask sent you. And as always, consult a licensed and trusted financial planner who can take into account your financial goals, needs, and risk appetite before investing. Shane, thanks for taking some time to join me on the show.
Welcome. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, you've flown down for this, which I'm very humbled by and appreciate that. And also shout out to Mitch, who sometimes hosts the show as well. And I know he's really looking forward to this conversation. One of the things that I've heard you talk about, I know you write about, is this idea of being guided by your soul. I just want to put that out there. Mm-hmm. You can start wherever you want. But I'd love for that to be the opening kind of segue to the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, it's a fantastic place to start. I think when I wrote that, or when I really put that to paper in 12 years ago, whatever it was, actually probably even a little bit longer, it was really about trusting your intuition and understanding where some of the things that push us in particular directions, where that comes from. And yeah, I use the word soul, and some people may rail against that as a too esoteric or too sort of woo-woo. But really what I wanted to capture is this idea of our intuition and the things that can actually maintain us as a human can be really good for us if we listen to some of that. And I know from personal experience of spending many, many years ignoring that as well, and just going along a preconceived idea about what I thought, particularly masculinity, or what I thought that would be, and by extension to that, what I thought a leader should be, and that's been the focus of my work for the last 10, 15 years. But getting back to the idea of where I first had this and heard that phrase of being guided by your soul and instead of driven by your ego, that really came from an experience I had in Iraq in 2006. So after having a long career, which we'll probably get into, in police and special operations, and then extending that into working with the US Department of Defense in Iraq during the Iraq War. One of our interpreters was an older guy we called the professor, and for a good reason. He was a professor of English at Baghdad University for a long time before the Iraq War and the coalition had come in and sort of taken control of the country. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that was in essence what happened. And he found that by extension of the conflict that was happening in Iraq, that the only jobs that they could get, particularly for him as an English professor, was as an interpreter. So basically the Baghdad University had ceased to exist, and even under the Saddam regime that had ceased to exist. And he came to work for us. And he was a quiet man who was in his 60s, very unassuming, didn't really say too much. He did his job. But he had this aura about him. And I remember sitting there one day with him, and I was going through some sort of personal turmoil at the time, not just in relation to where I was working and the chaotic environment that I was working in, but it was also at a personal level. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know who I was. I really was struggling with that personal identity. And, we sat down and we were having a coffee and I smoked at the time. I don't smoke anyone. Anyway, I smoked at the time and he was a heavy smoker, and we were sitting outside. It was about, it must have been 50 degrees. It was so hot outside. We weren't even in Baghdad. We were south of Baghdad. So we were really firmly in the middle of nowhere. And, he had this way about him, as I said, and we were chatting away, and, I can't even remember how it came up, but he just sort of said, you're either guided by your soul or driven by your ego. And I think at the time I sort of went, what? I didn't really catch on to what he was trying to say. And without even acknowledging it, I don't know that I even spoke to him further about that or even asked further questions. To me, it just sounded like some sort of an esoteric, out there statement. But over time, it actually had this profound sort of eye-opening impact on me where I thought, okay. And then I started to unpack that over time. And then that progressed into really thinking about what I was doing in that moment. Why was I in Iraq in the first place? Why had I gone down the path of working in very difficult, very chaotic, very dangerous, very masculine-driven environments, and why that had become such an important, in inverted commas, part of my life. And it was just fascinating, fascinating to actually start to examine that. I know that's a very long answer to a very short question. But.
Yeah, it's what we want. If I'm not mistaken, he asked you something along the lines of like, why are you here?
Ah, that's right. Sorry, now you're jogging my memory. Yes, why are you here? And I gave him some sort of yearbook answer, I'm here to protect your country, or, here to rebuild Iraq, or some other, bullshit response that you would typically hear from that masculine response or that egoic response. And he basically challenged that and said, bullshit. Yeah. He said, he called me out on what it was that I was sort of sprouting. And it was one of the first times I think that I'd actually heard that. Especially in that environment, like people, you have a lot of people who are, who were like me at the time, definitely running on their ego and just doing things because that was what we thought was the right way forward. And nobody really ever questioned that, And the fact that somebody actually said that actually had had that profound impact of shaking the reality of why I thought I was there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it started to expose some of the stories that we tell ourselves. Yeah.
Now, you grew up in a small town in New South Wales called Narromine.
Yep.
Does the kind of the origin story of that kind of self-reflection, that internal compass, if you will, did that start there, do you think? Is that where it and then kind of like, what was the story that led up to that? And what was the kind of monologue that you had for yourself?
Do you mean in leading up to Iraq, do you mean?
Yeah, and how did you go from that to the time, like, you talk about, in the TED Talk in particular, you talk about your own experience being the captain of the cricket team and those types of, the sequence of events and the kind of narrative that we tell ourselves because society tells us of that thing.
So, well, certainly growing up in a small country town, it's you sort of see yourself as a big fish in a small ocean. And I certainly saw myself that way. So again, that's an egoic response, even as a teenager. I played all of the sports in town. I was pretty successful in what it is that I do. I was one of the school captains. So there was a lot of early sort of leadership success, I suppose, with how I lived my life. And, and when I look back, I think about, growing up and going to school with Glenn McGrath, for example, and playing cricket with Glenn. And we played in the same cricket team, and I was the captain. I was the biggest. I was the most bold person in the team, and I essentially got my way. When I was that age, and it's funny. I got a bit of a comeuppance when Glenn would come and ask me to bowl. Can I have a bowl? I say no, get down to fine leg. And I think even after I started to recognise that this kid had some talent, I mean, I was the same age. I think maybe I'm 6 months older than Glenn. And so even after I recognised that he had some talent, the capacity to be able to put my own ego aside to allow somebody else to succeed was not there. So it was that typical competitive, no, you get in the fine leg, you go and do that. I know best, and I think that you should go and do that. And we see this play out now with a lot of the stuff that we see in leadership as well. So we'll get to that shortly, I'm sure. But it really highlighted just how out of sync I was with reality, and how the soul, so to speak. So getting back even to talking about with the professor, the soul was far removed from the ego. The ego had completely taken over. And as I said, I got my comeuppance when Glenn actually moved to another team, and because we then in parallel to that, we started working together at the State Bank in Narromine, and we would joke about it every day. Every day he would come in and say, you wouldn't give me a bowl, and I would say that's because you were rubbish, and then we would just have this banter backwards and forwards, but he would get his vengeance on the weekend, because he would then bowl at me when we were playing cricket on the weekends, and no doubt they were all short. I'll be ducking for cover, because as in a short period of time, he went from just run-of-the-mill pace to actually being pretty quick, and that just his rise was meteoric. In even look, I think even historically, you read back through his own memoirs, he talks about basically going from playing cricket in Narromine, which was nothing special, but it was decent sort of club cricket within the country network, to representing the region, to going to New South Wales, to playing for Australia. It was a very, very short period of time. Somewhere in there, I remember actually I was at Coogee Police Station, so I was actually part of Randwick. Randwick Police Station, but it was in Coogee Bay Road in Coogee in Sydney. And I think he was playing a New South Wales second 11 match down in Coogee Oval, which is down next to the beach. And he knew that I was working in Randwick Police Station. He came up to see me because, we became decent friends. And he came up and saw me, and we were joking because the Australian cricket team was in New Zealand at the time. And he said, if you'd given me a bowl, I could have been in New Zealand. And we both just laughed, and I don't think even he realised just how good he was either. And I think he just developed so quickly, and then just went. I think he only played like 8 first-class games before he made the Australian side. So it was quite an amazing rise for him. So when I think back to that discussion with the professor. Yeah, definitely. Certainly recognise that early on with my teenage years with Glenn, and then working forward to the professor of fully understanding exactly what had happened back then. I think that was the catalyst to then go, as much as I shouldn't use that word because it gets overused, but it was really the catalyst to look back and say, I've been doing this for a long period of time.
Yeah. So because you're a big guy, you're a fit guy, right? Does this kind of idea about like what we have as masculinity, like at the time you would have been fueled on testosterone, you would have a lot of energy, you know, you obviously go to the police force, which we can talk about. Did that come from anywhere now that you reflect on it? Like, does it just come from like the society's expectations? Because you talk about a lot this kind of fallback position for men, and particularly younger men. Fallback position is kind of like aggression, it's kind of dominance, that kind of feel. And one thing you may not know about me is I was kind of in that mindset, right? Myself. And, you know, I did the stereotypical younger things, captain of the footy team, took some steroids, did all that sort of stuff, went to the army, you know, those types of things, right? Until I realized that, hey, well, this is probably not why I'm here. Like I was probably running away from something, not being pulled towards something. So that kind of push-pull idea. But like for you, did you have that? Like, did you, now that you reflect on it, do you think like you're running away or pushing away something, or where did it come from?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you're right. I think similar to even when I went to Iraq, but actually when I probably went to the police force, I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know who I was. And I was probably running away from the idea of finding out who I was. And for me, it was a lot easier because my father was a police officer. Right. So there was familiarity and I knew the culture to a point because I'd been exposed to it over many years. And some of the people that I was closest with in Narromine were young. I think there was about 5 police officers in Narromine, and some of the younger police officers were my friends. You know, I used to play tennis with them and everything. So the idea of joining the police was not scary. It was almost familiar and comfortable to do that. Which, you know, when we think about that, it's never about finding out who you are. It's just, I'm just going to follow somewhere that's comfortable. And that extends into now so much of the leadership stuff that I do, which is, you know, although we have a propensity to do things in a certain way, because they're comfortable, sometimes stepping out of that and taking the antithetical view is actually the thing that we need to do to move forward. I was just thinking too, because, you know, we follow this idea of comfortable. And again, as I said, this is why I take this approach with the way that I do my leadership training. And even reflecting back on one of the articles that you wrote in early October about the monkey mind. Oh, yeah. And you know, talking about confirmation bias, recency bias, and all of these things. And I think one of the things that we can do is effectively bring out, or as best we can, or expose, probably is the better way to describe it, our bias and our propensity to work in certain ways, and to actually bring that to our awareness, so we can then possibly take the antithetical view, or the, you know, as Charlie Munger would call it, we invert it, and look at it from a different angle, and be able to approach things in a way which is going to get us better results.
Yeah, it's interesting because I see this with business owners a lot, and you would see this in all the leadership training and things that you do. But particularly with small and medium-sized business owners, they kind of, the analogy would be that they're like joined at the hip with their business, and they can't step outside of it and look at it, maybe until they get like an annual financials and they go, oh shit, that's what it looks like. You know, there's some kind of third-party perspective that's like, actually, this is what it is right here. I know I've had that feeling many times, but I feel like people can do that with themselves. It kind of like take stock. We had a fantastic woman on the show many years ago, Andrea Clark, and she used an activity with us, which was, how would other people describe you when you're not in the room? And it's kind of trying to step you out of yourself to understand those behaviors. But I feel like for you, maybe that was the professor who was saying, well, this is how I view you. You know, and this is my opinion.
And as I said, he shook me out of that comfortable zone where you think you know who you are, and you know, I'm this, and yet you're not that at all. You know, you're just that's a facade. The real you, and this is why, you know, talking about being guided by your soul and not driven by your ego had such impact, was because the real you actually was someone completely different. And the facade was the the big, tough, fast, fit person who worked in dangerous environments. That was a facade.
Yeah, it's kind of that, like the apex male, right? Like this idea of, strong, motivated, fit, all these types of things.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Did that, I guess, one on the personal level, and this we'll relate this back to leadership and business and that sort of thing as the conversation goes on. But on a personal level, did that take its toll on you in any obvious ways, like relationships with other people, relationships with yourself, self-sabotaging behaviors, those types of things?
Absolutely. I did talk about it in my TED talk. Was the breakdown of relationships, the breakdown of connections with my children, because I was always sort of chasing something, and look, to be honest, I think some of that too was being scared or being scared or fearful, certainly, of the emotional connection that we develop with close, intimate contacts. And I know that I'm not the only one who has done that, and I would argue that it still continues in many, certainly in many guys, is that we're not sure how to emotionally connect with our loved ones, and that creates a distance. So the solution to that is to go and do other things, to go on deployment, to step into activities that actually are singular and allow me to do that by myself, and I don't have to worry about how do I deal with somebody who wants an emotional connection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And look, without any empirical evidence to back this up right at this moment, I think from my own perspective, I think I did that for a long time. Where you would seek the most difficult things to do to challenge yourself. And when I think about it in hindsight, a lot of that was to avoid the uncomfortableness of being in close emotional connection with somebody.
Yeah.
Because that's difficult.
Yeah.
That's a difficult thing to do.
I know, like in the NA community, the AA community, and you see this in the military, right, as well, where the first step is kind of the breaking down, admitting that you're powerless, just bearing all, so to speak, because then you can rebuild from that moment. But the moment that you're not rebuilding on like solid foundations, is it can crumble down at any one moment. Right? I know you did a lot of things personally when you got to that point where you were like, okay, how do I kind of almost detox my life and myself from this kind of attitude? I'm curious, like, if you could share maybe any of those kind of moments or things that you might have done. Like, I remember listening to the TED Talk, and I think you're in like Bavaria. You went somewhere and you did something where you were part of something, and I was like, that is total contrast to where he just was.
And I think I know what you're talking about. So when I left Iraq, I had a flight back to Dubai from Baghdad, and then from Dubai I had a flight back to Sydney, and I think I had a job lined up in somewhere in the security field. And look, somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that wasn't right for me. I knew that was not what I wanted. And again, probably, although the professor did shake me to start thinking about it more consciously, I think I'd known that for a long time. I think I'd known for a long time that this is not what I'm about. And I did draw the similarity, the story in the book of just talking about that you are not your job, and wearing body armor, carrying a submachine gun, and jumping out of vans, pointing guns at people is not who you are. And I did have that thought back in the day, but I just dismissed it. And I think it was only when I'd spoken to the professor that actually it really brought it front of mind. So when I finished my stint in Iraq, so I went to Dubai, and I made the decision on a whim to not take the flight back to Australia. So rejected whatever role that was to come back to, and decided to go the other way. So I went the other direction. And I think I just looked up flights to somewhere. So what I did, luckily at the time, the company who was flying me in and out were okay if I just parked my return ticket from Dubai back to Sydney, and I just booked my own ticket to go. And I think I just took the first flight to somewhere that was somewhere, and it was Athens. And I went to Athens, and then ended up just from there, just taking it on a whim. So, as you know, from military experience, you get so used to planning and everything has to be in a certain way, and you get very enamored by the idea of preparation. So everything's prepared. But I loved the idea of just going and not having a plan and just going wherever. So anyway, I ended up at Bavaria, or in the Bavarian region, and I was at Salzburg. I think that's what you were referring to.
Yeah.
And I went on the Sound of Music tour. And as a kid, and this is the thing, before the ego sort of took over and said, oh, that's not a cool thing to do, I loved watching the Sound of Music when I was a kid. And I went on the Sound of Music tour. I'm pretty sure, I think as I said in the book, I'm pretty sure I was the only straight male on that bus. But I'm sitting there singing show tunes and singing parts from Sound of Music, and I loved it. Seriously, I loved it. And in fact, if I was going to live somewhere in the world, I'd probably go back to Salzburg. Just the greenness and the freshness of Austria is beautiful. And then I came back and when you think about things that you would do if you're not restricted by fear, that was one of the things where I went, you know what? When I was a kid, I really enjoyed doing musical theatre. I was in a couple of plays when I was in school, and I really enjoyed it. And I did. I came back, and a couple of years later, went and actually was in the Sound of Music on stage in Canberra.
Wow.
I was in the Phantom of the Opera, but I was just a minor role. There was a fantastic guy who was playing the Phantom, and probably played in about 8 or 9 different shows over a 5-year period.
Yeah, wow.
It was just one of those things you just went,
yeah.
What am I going to do?
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
It's, when I was reading about your story and researching you, it struck me as very similar to the journey that Terry Crews went on in the United States. So Terry Crews is the big black muscular guy from Brooklyn Nine-Nine and White Chicks and all that.
Yep.
And people may not know his story, but he's actually a fantastic artist.
Yeah.
Right. But he was big, he was strong. So he went into the NFL, right? Like he became a pro football player and then got into theater. And then, that's the whole story. And he talks about like the inherited kind of trait of masculinity from his father and how that relationship kind of changed him. But I was thinking about this is like with you as well, like you had this like police career, what we would associate in Victoria, I think it's the Special Operations Group.
Correct.
What we call a SOGI or like kind of like the SWAT of Australia.
Correct.
And, that's kind of, again, it goes back to that image of like strong, powerful male, right? And I wondered if, and this might be a bit off on a tangent, but I wondered if like you needed to experience that in order to then come full circle and then be singing, in a choir or something like that. I wondered if you needed to go on that journey. And I'm thinking about this from the perspective of a lot of males, and it could be a very similar story, but in a different way for females as too, right? There's so many, preconceptions about what leadership should be, about like the role models that we have in society. But yeah, I guess this is a bit of a butchered question. Is like kind of, did you need to go on that journey to get to singing in Salzburg, or just going along on that journey?
Mate, it's not a butchered question at all. I think it's a fantastic question, and I think you're right. You do need to go on that journey. I think, and I have reflected on this myself, is that without that, then would you be here or would you be there? Would you realise? Because contrast is a fantastic teacher. When we realise what we really don't want to do, it helps us to start to find what we really want to do. And as I mentioned before, with inversion, or and I love. I think I read somewhere about Charlie Munger described inversion as avoiding stupidity, essentially, and I love that idea because, but in this regard, you need to sort of experience the inverted view to be able to work out what you actually want to do, or what is actually going to work for you. So I agree with you. I think that it's a good part of life. And you're right that many guys and girls, but I'll speak from the male perspective, will go on this journey without even probably realizing it. They will eventually come full circle. So as you mentioned, you'll go to the gym, you might pop a few steroids, you might do a few certain things, or you might be a fitness influencer, and which is great, by the way. But that creates an image, and then maybe in a few years' time that will evolve into something else.
Yeah,
and that's all right.
Yeah, that's okay too.
Yeah, absolutely.
You talk about this idea of inner stillness. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
I think for me, the inner stillness, and this relates to whether it's us as just as a person, or whether we're actually leading teams or whatever, the idea of inner stillness, and again, it's not esoteric. We're not talking about singing Kumbaya in the mornings or anything like that. It's just the idea that we can take in our surroundings and be calm and still, or how did I describe it? Calm and ease. And again, a lot of that comes with presence. And when I describe leadership presence, it's really about just understanding what's happening around us. So, when we're going for a walk, and don't get me wrong, I love wearing some earphones and going for a walk and having a podcast in my ears. But sometimes,
thank you for saying that while you're on a podcast.
I do listen to this podcast. But sometimes it's just nice to actually not have any distractions and just to go for a walk in the bush, listen to the sounds. You can hear all the little bits, and that to me is what stillness is about. It's calming the, what they describe in psychological terms sometimes as the monkey mind, which wants to grab onto everything. It's just calming that down and allowing your body to rest, because as you would know, the mind is the thing that drives a lot of our stresses and anxieties and any other things that detract from not just our performance, but just from being happy, just simple things. So, and again, this is, I'm not an expert. I'm not a monk. I'm not I don't do meditation every day. But I do really keep this front of mind as far as how do I just create a bit of stillness.
Yeah, we had a guy called Nick Majuli on the show. He's like this quantitative investor and brainiac from the US. And he wrote a book. And one of the things he talked about in the book was this idea that when people comes to saving money, right, this is an interesting analogy for people, is he referenced a bunch of psychological work that showed that the kind of worry about budgeting is worse than the fact that you don't budget at all. Like the actual cost, the mental load of worrying about something that might happen is worse than actually the worry that you get when you're in it. Yeah. And I think about that a lot because we kind of front load our stress in that regard. Yeah. And it's kind of like just letting go of that and just being like, what will be, will be. Yeah. How about if we take kind of the idea of like what you said before about with the bowling with Glenn, and kind of like not using your position to elevate him, so to speak, at the time, or not recognizing that. And we take all these concepts together. How does something like putting aside ego help a manager or a leader in a business? Like, how does that come together?
I think one of the biggest problems, I suppose, and I say that with a caveat of acting from ego as a leader, is that we assume that what we are doing is correct, and we assume that what we are, or the approach that we are taking, is the right approach. What they talk about in quantum terms as collapsing the field. So it restricts our ability to make choices based on rich data, and it actually restricts our ability to make good choices. It narrows us down to a singular approach because we're acting from ego. We're acting from the idea that we are correct or that we have the right approach. So that's one of the issues that I see with management and leaders, and it's the primary approach with how we do things at the moment with working with these leaders from overseas. We're dealing with sort of mid-level managers who have a lot of responsibility, and some of them are in charge of 700 people. Like they've got 700 people under their charge, so they have a lot of responsibility, and just getting them to think about things not from the perspective of this is the way that I do things, but actually starting to broaden their horizons, really open that field to take into account different ideas, different approaches, hearing different voices. So it is diversity in any way, shape or form, or, even in academic terms, they call it like heterogeneity, which is really that it's the adoption of different ideas into an approach which is actually going to solve the problem, not just help you feel good about whatever the problem is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So, you're the only person that's ever kind of invoked quantum mechanics or quantum theory on a podcast. But I think I might have spoken about this. I don't know if I've spoken about it publicly, but there's a interesting kind of problem in quantum mechanics, which is that when it's called the observer effect.
Yeah.
Which is when you look at something, it changes. So then you can't really observe it at all. Just the act of looking at it changes it.
Yeah.
And I often think about this with people's money. So you can score me on this as an analogy for people or a metaphor, whatever. I often think that when people look at a problem with their finances, it solves itself without them realizing.
Yeah.
So if the act of just looking at it means that they'll solve a problem. And I think about this for the whole of human society, to be honest. It's like acknowledging it exists.
Yep.
Often resolves the issue before you've realized you've resolved the issue. Yeah. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely makes sense. And the opposite of that would be ignoring it by not opening your account, or
fearing
what it is that you might see, creates the adverse opposite. So I think that works. I think that works.
When you talked before about stillness and calmness, right? Calm and ease and these types of things. You've operated in some pretty stressful environments. Like I'm thinking like Baghdad or Iraq during the 2000s would have been hectic. You would have gone to numerous crime scenes in your police days, like lots of confrontation, lots of aggression, lots of different things going on, lots of competing ideas in your mind at one time. How does someone like you, what advice would you give to your younger self to say, hey, this is how you find that stillness. This is how you find that calm. Like what approach, and I'm thinking from the perspective of leaders here in businesses that may not have a gun in their face or something like that, but they've got some type of complex environment they're in. How do you find that?
I'm not trying to dance out of it, but it depends. It depends, and it depends on the situation. If From when you just started to describe that, I immediately went back to an incident where, in 1995, and it's like, just bear with me for a moment. Okay. In 1995, I was working with the police dog squad at the time, and we were down at Bondi Beach, and it was New Year's Eve, Bondi Beach, at Christmas Eve. So only a few days before, there had been a massive riot at Bondi Beach. Between a couple of ethnic groups, and the police were involved as well. And then it was all on through, it was before social media, but through various channels, there was a call for people to go to Bondi Beach on New Year's Eve and to create a ruckus, essentially.
Yep.
So we were down there, and there was, several police, obviously, and I was actually the only dog squad member down there at the time. And notwithstanding all the other stuff that happened during the night, we found ourselves at about 3 a.m. standing in the middle of an island in Bondi Beach. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bondi. Quite a large boulevard, and in the middle was a couple of islands. We found ourselves surrounded by literally thousands of people throwing bottles at us. Bottles, this, that, and everything else. And a senior officer actually said, let's go and get them. And there was a couple of people who were throwing things that were obvious. And I actually said to him, I said, mate, we can't do that. We can't do that. And I do remember at the time feeling very relaxed about it, because I just went, we can't do that, because think about the bigger picture. This is going to cause an absolute riot, literally.
Yeah.
Because if we go in there to try and arrest people in a group of thousands where there were 50 of us, there was no way in the world we were going to get out of that one without having some substantial injuries.
Yeah.
And again, I was well below his rank, and I said, no, let's not, because there's a bigger picture here and we need to take into account all of the situations. So getting back to your question about stillness, I think that's where we really need to take into account as much information as we can. And again, I think we're channeled into thinking in a particular way, particularly as we become stressed. And I do this in the leadership programs, talking about emotional intelligence, and how emotional intelligence is not just a nice to have, it is vital for leadership. And it doesn't mean dynamic environments or dangerous environments. It is vital for everybody. Because if you lack the emotional intelligence to be able to deal with even somebody who comes into the office and having a bad day, or their performance has been a little bit down because they're having some problems at home, if as a leader we're not cognizant of what are the things that might be driving that, then we can lose that person, or we can create more stress for them, which then creates a downtick in productivity and all of those things, and it takes away from morale and all the rest of it. And yeah, so I hope I haven't just waffled too much there.
No, not at all. Yeah, it's fascinating, because like a lot of leadership involves compromise, it would seem to me. Like, so you have, like you say, there's this kind of competing port of call where you want to go in one direction because you're the leader, and you kind of have to, at least it would seem to me, and you can correct me here, it would seem to me that you have to kind of instill confidence in the team.
Yep.
That we're going to go in this direction, and here's how great it's going to be. Because without you kind of leading and waving the flag, we're going to go in this direction, they're not going to follow, right? But at the same time, you have to be open to the bigger perspective, which could be, well, Jill's rocked up today. There's obviously something going wrong. She's got a pretty shit attitude, and she's pivotal to what we're going to do today, but she doesn't rock up. So you have a choice. Well, we all need to go in this direction, but Jill's not going to come, and the whole thing's going to break down. So what do you do in that environment? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like you said, maybe it's just a perspective. Well, Jill will be here tomorrow, and we're all going to be okay.
Yep.
But in the moment, that can be quite hard as a leader to kind of it is a bit of your ego, but just to put your general kind of momentum aside and rally the troops the next day, so to speak.
Yeah. You're right, and that example is a good one, because it just shows the complexity of even just normal workplaces. It's difficult, and I always talk about, I think I open in every leadership forum that leadership is challenging. It's not an easy thing to do. It's easy to manage, or sorry, I shouldn't say it's easy. It's easier, I think, and again, this is just my personal opinion, because we can easily manage process, but we lead people. And when we start to lead people, we understand that we work in an emotional environment, because we're emotional beings. We all have things that push our buttons. We have different ways of doing things. One of the books I picked up, I just got back from Sri Lanka only a few days ago, but on the way there, I picked up a book at the airport called Surrounded by Idiots. I don't know if you've ever...
No, I haven't. I think I've heard of it.
Yeah, and it's a book that's just been reprinted and rejigged. And but essentially that is an example of that book is all about the model that I've been using anyway for years to identify the differences in the way that people do things. And so understanding that people do things differently, and not becoming emotionally embroiled in the fact that, they're doing it incorrectly, or I would like a little bit more detail on that, or there's too much detail on that, or, I think you should be more people focused, whatever the case may be. And just understanding that, a workplace is made up of all types of people. And our job as a leader is to just make sure that we're not becoming overwhelmed by our own emotional response when we see things being done differently, which is a big part of that emotional intelligence piece that I was just talking about. And how we manage it, how we discuss that through forums overseas.
The reason why I wanted to bring this book in, which is No Rules Rules, the Reed Hastings book. I don't know if you've read it.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book about the culture at Netflix. The reason why I bring that in is when they came out with their culture deck, they call it in the 2000s, it was kind of like shock and awe to the general business press at the time. But one of the things that they talk about in there is the book's called No Rules Rules. And they talk about leading with context, not rules, and process and these types of things. One of the industries and one of the organizations that's known for absolute structure and process and rules is the Department of Defense, military here in Australia as well. So your PhD, which I'm not mistaken, looked at kind of like organizational change about all these different types of things, but you kind of looked at it through like a hierarchical organization. And I believe you use the Australian Defence like organization writ large as kind of the lens at which you looked at these things. And so we're used to in business and in society to have this kind of top-down approach of whoever's the general then has the, whatever the ranks are below that. And then you get down to the grunts down the bottom, right? And that's kind of how things run. And this is probably just a big question of what did you find when you studied those types of organizations and those structures?
That's a great question. Just to compress a thesis into a couple of minutes.
That should be easy.
I mean, the impetus or the reason I actually started that in the first place was I wanted to know why, because I'd worked in and around defence for a long time. I've never been a part of the defence force, but I've worked with a lot of defence people and then as a contractor and as an external consultant to defence as well. But I always saw it as a rigid organisation where things just bogged down. And I wanted to know why they couldn't be more adaptable. Because I know, having read much of their documentation over the last 10 or 15 years, even going back to, I think it was 2009, where they talked about adaptability or adaptive leadership as a way forward. But actually all of their processes and all of their procedures and all of their structure actually fights against that. And I wanted to know why. And that was the impetus for wanting to understand an organisation which is trying to move in a certain direction because, as you say, no rules rules. And I would assume, again, as I said, I haven't read the book, but I could assume by the title it's talking about this sort of open structure where the guidance doesn't have to come from the top all the time. You can lead from the middle, so to speak. And that's what I found in this, is that by having the top-down structure, which is very hierarchical, particularly driven by processes, rules, but also customs, the way that things have always been done. And, places like organisations such as defence, and I'm not talking about Australian defence only, this is worldwide, they are driven by customs and tradition and things that have gone before them, and that actually gets in the way of innovation. It gets in the way of innovation, it gets in the way of creativity. So that's a lot of what I found, was that actually what they're finding, what they're doing is they're actually working against their aspiration to be adaptable, because they always revert back to the status quo.
So what about then, so one of the things that you're familiar with is, like, you go back to that story you told us before about being at Bondi. You're in the middle of this traffic island and there's thousands of people surrounding you guys, right? Status quo would have been like your ranking officer there says, we're going to go arrest that guy who just threw that bottle. Right? But in the moment, you have to make the decision not to do that. So that's, for me at least, it seems like an example of where the hierarchical structure just didn't work. Like there was a mistake ahead of you and you had to say something. But most of the time, it seems that doesn't happen. Like people in organizations, they don't want to speak up, or they don't feel like they can, or even if they do, it doesn't get heard. So how does a leader foster... what's the kind of antidote to that?
I think when you're talking about that particular incident, that inversion view of what really could go wrong here. What really could go wrong? Well, there are many things that could go wrong. And then we ask ourselves, well, how do we avoid that? What are the things that we need to put in place to avoid that? So in answer to your question, how do we try to promote that idea of being able to lead from anywhere?
Yeah.
That's a difficult one because many organizations, even the flatter structures, still have somebody who's the CEO or the general manager or somebody who is calling the shots. And there is still this feeling that if you are a mid-level manager, that you need to be careful about what you say, you need to be careful about what you challenge. That I don't think we can solve that in this podcast. But I will, give you an idea about what it is that I do when I'm overseas, because we get similar things, and that is, how do we construct a conversation, or how do we construct our communication to make sure that we can, if we need to, express ourselves in a way where we're not pushing back, but we are trying to create different ideas with our senior leadership by communicating with them in a way that they like to be communicated with. So this is a lot about what I talk about overseas, or even here as well. So it's understanding communication theory and understanding communication styles, so that if senior leaders particularly like to communicate in a certain way, we can recognise the cues and clues that they give us about how they like to communicate, and we can actually start to influence from the middle. So we can actually start to communicate with them in a way where we're not pushing back, we're not being insubordinate, but we are putting our ideas forward in a way which is mature and hopefully able to be accepted.
So would it be fair to say that maybe step one of this is identifying the language that they speak in?
Yep.
So if they're like an analytical leader and they prefer to have a A4 sheet of paper that's got all the data on it, communicate to them in that language.
So the first step, actually, there's a step before that, and the step before that is understanding how you communicate.
Right.
Which is where we start. So we always start with what it is that you do, how it is that you prefer to lead, how it is that you prefer to communicate. And the communication is really just an extension of our behaviours. So we run behavioural instruments which allow us to get a bit of a picture of what our default might be. Mm-hmm. But there are very obvious cues and clues, and these are not new. A lot of the instrument that I use is only a recent sort of last 100 years development. But the essence of it has been around since the ancient Greeks.
Right.
It has been around for a long time, where they started to observe even so long ago the different motivations of humans.
Okay.
And so getting it back to the current context, we can give people the idea about what things we might see with the way that we communicate with people. And it's not that we assume where they might fit or that we assume that they are this particular style, but at least we can make an informed guess on where it is that they might be. And there are honestly dead set giveaways. How long the emails are. If we get an email which is hugely detailed with millions of points in there, we can make an assumption about a particular way that somebody likes to communicate. If it's in short dot points where it might say, A, B, and C, and then it says, come and see me if you've got any problems, then we can assume within a reasonable range that person fits within a certain thing. So again, it comes back. So the first step is us, and then it's what we think another person may communicate like, and then we start to practice to build up our confidence to be able to then communicate with them in that way. And that's a lot of, again, so much of the focus for people working in particularly militarized organizations overseas, how they communicate with their seniors is I think it's probably the biggest question that we get.
When you say like you're working overseas and stuff, who are the types of organizations that you mainly work with when you go over there, or even domestically? Like,
Yeah, so for the last 3 years, it's been primarily maritime security agencies within different governments throughout Southeast Asia. So, but that can include, immigration, customs, coast guards, fisheries, various other agencies. There's a whole raft of agencies that I work for, that I've worked with, and a lot of those, as I said, they're quite militarized.
Yeah.
So they're very highly structured, hierarchically, and they want to learn. They want to know how it is that they can affect better outcomes.
Mm. I've often heard that one of the criticisms of the Russian army is that they're very hierarchical, and their troops on the ground basically can't make decisions properly because they have these reporting lines.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you talk about this. So Shane, you talk a lot about holding space for contradiction. What does that practically look like?
So it works both ways in that, but it might be different both ways.
Yeah.
So this is where once we have the knowledge, and this is why leadership is challenging, because it is an active and intentional act to try and create those connections both ways. So for speaking, and I like what you say there about holding space, because we may make some assumptions about how our senior may communicate, and we would work to that. And if the response is not what we expect, then we might become what's the word?
Probably disenfranchised. Or...
disheartened. We might think, it hasn't worked. But I think that's where we need to, as you say, we need to hold space for adjusting. So we go, okay, well, that hasn't quite worked. Maybe I was a little bit off in the way that we did this, or maybe there's other things going on for them, or maybe it's just not the time. And again, for dealing with subordinates, we might need to adjust to be a little bit different. We know that at times, I've spoken about this many times with the groups that I work with. We're not suggesting that as a middle manager or as wherever you are within an organisation that you just become a sponge for everybody else to push you around. We know at times we're going to have to say, no, you do this. Yeah. This needs to be done. Yeah. But if that's our default, if that's the only way that we do things, then we're going to have problems. Which is basically the premise of being adaptive in the first place, is that we can choose from a position of strength. So we can choose from a stable platform, which includes our emotional intelligence and our self-awareness and just knowing what it is that we're trying to achieve. We can actually use that as a stable platform to make decisions based on what the situation requires, not just the way that we've always done it.
One of the things we touched on earlier on was this idea of like quantum-inspired leadership and practices and these types of things. One of the things you talk about and you reference quite often is this idea of having two opposing truths in your mind. Yep. Can you talk to us about what that actually looks like in practice?
Yeah, so they call it in quantum mechanics superposition, which is essentially, as you just described, it's a holding of what we might call competing ideas, or at least holding more than one idea in our minds at the same time. A practical example of that, I think, would be something like, and we see this played all the time, like if there's a mistake made within an organisation, somebody makes a mistake, somebody forgets to send an email and it causes a disruption in a process. They don't send the details to somebody who's going to be in a podcast and they don't turn up. Now, it's easy for us if we're just thinking about things in a collapsed field, as I mentioned before, where there's only one response, then we would immediately go to blaming a particular person. But the idea of superposition is that we can hold the idea that there are possibly 2 or even 3 different ways or reasons why that's actually occurred. So one could be that the person forgot. One could be that there was a breakdown in comms. One could be that there is a tech issues, whatever the case may be, or that there's a system failure somewhere along the lines. And the idea being, it's like Schrodinger's cat. It's you don't really know until you actually start to observe it and investigate what that was about. So the idea being with superposition is that we can actually hold all these ideas as equal until we start to observe what was actually going on. Because it's easy for us as humans to assume and go down a particular role go down a particular path because, they've talked about this with neuroscience, which I've taken an active interest in over a long period of time, is that, we have this propensity to create the neural pathways which allow us to navigate through as comfortably as we can. And one of those things we'll do is to make assumptions. And we make those assumptions based on very little information.
Yep.
So, that's how I would describe it in a practical term.
So it's more that, it's almost like the heuristics that we kind of, we build those pathways to make the heuristic fit, line of best fit. That's what we're drawing every time.
Yeah, because it fits either our narrative or what we've come to understand over a long period of time. And I think, even reverting back to, what we talked about with the professor, he absolutely shook that heuristic of who it was that I thought I was or who I thought I was. That's what we need.
Yeah. Do you think that then to be an effective leader, you need to be an inherently curious person? Do you think you need to, because you need to be open to these ideas, right? You kind of need to have the humility to be like, I'm wrong.
Yep.
I once heard when I was studying, I think it was economics, I had this really great professor, and he got up in front of the crowd and he said, people often ask me, do I get scared coming in here and talking to 500 of you about economics because I might be wrong or I might not know the subject matter or someone might ask a difficult question? And he said, I just admit that I'm not the smartest person in the room. Yep. I might be older and have some wisdom, but I'm not the smartest one in this room.
Yep.
And the moment I admitted that was the moment that I became a better professor.
Yeah.
So I wondered, do you have to be like a humble, open-minded, curious person to be an effective leader?
Firstly, it's a great example, and I really like that story of the professor.
You've got a professor, I've got one.
Yeah. Do you have to be? I would have to say no, because otherwise we're starting to put people into pigeonholes as well. You have to be these things, and I really sort of rail against that because ultimately everybody will be themselves, and the way to be an effective leader is to understand yourself, know what your strengths and weaknesses are, understand what is needed in a situation, and when I say situation, I also mean our teams or our environments or our field, so to speak, in quantum speak. Understand what that is and how we interact with that. Now, would humility be a part of that? Absolutely. What were the other words that you used there? Apologies.
I guess just being open-minded and curious.
Curiosity is a fantastic one, because I think as a trait for a leader, I think it's a good one to have. Am I saying that it is the only one that you should have? Like charisma is a great one too, but we know throughout history that charismatic leaders are not always good leaders. They can be effective at pushing an agenda and getting things done that they want done. But that doesn't mean they're a good leader necessarily. So, and again, and I say that with a caveat too, because labeling things good and bad is also a little bit problematic. But charisma, open-mindedness, curiosity. I love curiosity because I think that gets us to really ask why. And I would argue that we don't ask ourselves enough why. Why are we doing this? Why am I doing this? And if we can ask ourselves honestly as a leader why we're doing this thing, or why am I working in this direction? What is the impetus behind that? I think that helps us to get clarity.
For sure.
And once we've got that clarity, it helps us to then let everybody know around us what we're doing. It helps us.
I think I got a couple more questions for you, Shane, but one of them is you've written about AI being a leadership issue. And artificial intelligence is creating this huge amount of change in workplaces and organizations across the world. You specialize in organizational change, and I'm curious what you meant by this. Why is artificial intelligence a leadership issue?
Yeah, so I think I said at the time it's not a tech issue, it's a leadership issue.
Yeah.
I think we often fall into the trap of thinking that it's just something that the tech department will look after, but it is a leadership issue insofar as when we break it down, the implementation of AI is a large change initiative, which is that how do we bring AI into the mainstream of organizations, taking into account obviously things like security issues and how we maintain safety and security and everything within the organization, particularly when we're starting to talk about public sectors, defense, etc. How we lead using AI, I think, is the key, and that's what I was really getting at with that particular article, in making sure that we don't just dismiss it because either we don't understand it or that we fear it. So that's what I mean by it's a leadership issue in how we implement, how we use it, how we can use it to our advantage. I've talked about it helping us with decision making, for example, and the thinking behind that is that it's not so much that it makes decisions for us, but it helps us or it creates a sounding board for us to examine our own thinking, and helps us to move forward and make good decisions. I really do think that. But again, I think it's a human issue, and I think it's a human responsibility to make sure that we use it in a way which is complementing what we do, not replacing what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I like it. I was going to ask one thing that fell out of this, which is I'm a bit of a techno kind of nerd, not as in the music, as in technology. I love technology.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, you can listen to techno all you want. That's fine. So I've built a bunch of things using AI.
Yeah.
Before AI, things that were AI like before AI was such a thing.
Yeah.
So I'm really into it. But at first with my team, I was really apprehensive because I didn't want it to become a crutch. I wanted it to become an enabler.
Yeah.
And I was really resistive of that, if I'm fair. I'm still kind of am in some ways, because I kind of envisage this future where I ask a question of one of the team and the team replies with AI, which has happened already. And then my AI replies to their AI. And then there's actually, what are we even doing here? Like the two of us should just not even be here.
Yeah.
And there may as well be no connection at all.
Yeah.
When a leader is given new information and there is that ego, it's often the case that we are very resistive of change, even if it's for the betterment of organizations. I guess my question is quite a broad and sweeping one to kind of put a bow on all of this today, which is, how do you not be resistive? Like, what is it in particular? Like, if you could give like one piece of advice, like how do you embrace change?
Yeah. What I've found over a long period of time in dealing with change is people don't understand why. If we as leaders can communicate why we're doing something and provide justification for that, not that we have to justify ourselves, but at least provide information as to why this is being implemented or why we're going in this direction, or why we're putting a few boundaries around the way that we use AI, and some sort of process for how we would use it. I think that is where we start to break down the barriers of change. I've worked on many change programs over the years, and that's been my experience. My experience has been that if we can reduce the amount of stimuli that people go through when something new happens, when something new occurs, or when something comes along which says you've got to do things differently, because as I mentioned before, we're sort of predisposed to that pathway, as you mentioned, the heuristics. We're predisposed to a pathway which is convenient or easy or comfortable. Whenever we go through a change period or whenever we go through something which is new, then that upsets that because it means that we've got to create new neural pathways. Look, an example that I've used for many years is, how many of us have driven to work via the same route every day, and sometimes we have gotten to work and think, how did I get here? Because we are so used to that particular route that we've taken to work. But what happens if we're having a conversation with somebody on the way to work, and we can normally do that easily, but yet we come to a detour in the road and we've got to go through a part of town we've never been through before. When we're having the discussion with somebody, that is then deteriorated because we struggle to be able to do two things at once because we're now learning a new pathway literally to get to work, which means that upsets the normal way that we would have done things. So the conversation would be diminished. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's probably again, that's the that's the reasoning behind why we give people the why as much as we can. And, uncertainty is one of those things, through neuroscience, when people work in uncertain environments, which is a big part of my work history, when people work in uncertain environments, we need to provide them as much information as we can. Now, that doesn't mean that we can give them all information all of the time because sometimes they're not either privy to that information or they don't need it to do their jobs to their full capacity. But we as leaders can be intentional about how much information we give so that we are providing as much certainty as we can so that helps them to, again, release the fight-flight that they may go through. Yeah.
I've only got two more questions for you, which are the quick ones that I normally have at the end. One's from Mitch. But if people wanted to get in contact with you, if organizations listening to this wanted to work with you, or people just wanted to follow along, what would be the best resource destination? Where can they go?
Look, probably LinkedIn is probably the best way, and just under my name, and I'm sure that'll probably be in the notes, or even my email address, which we'll put in the notes as well. Sure. Just contact me directly. I'm launching in the new year a new sort of direction, which is pretty much inspired by a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. It's in the direction of a lot of the stuff we've spoken about today. And I'll be launching an app in the future as well, relating to leadership and the utilization of AI also.
Cool. Love it. So I've got two final questions. The first one normally comes from Mitch, and it's this. If you and I are going for a bite to eat anywhere in the world, where are you taking me and what are we eating?
Look, bearing in mind that I'm all about calm, relax, it would have to be somewhere in the Mediterranean, sitting in a nice beachfront cafe, probably with maybe a bit of fish and chips. Yeah. Or do they have? Yeah, I'm sure they have chips in the Mediterranean, but they might have a little Mediterranean salad or something with a nice piece of grilled fish.
I like that idea. I remember sitting in a place not far out of Athens last year doing just that, and it was very special.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so
particularly if you've got the whitewash walls and the blue trimming. It's gorgeous.
It's special. Final question, Shane, is if you could go back in time and tell your younger self one thing about money, finance, life, anything that we've talked about today, leadership, anything, whatever you wanted to tell your younger self, you can drop in at any point in time and tell younger Shane one thing. What would it be?
Oh, look, I think it would be even going back through history of investing. So, we're on an investing podcast. I would have started earlier and just keep pumping $50 a week or whatever it was back in the day and put that in there. I mean, we've talked about, ego and the moments of realization back in history, but yeah, I think I would have done that back in the day.
Cool. I like it. Well, Shane, I know you've flown down for this, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day and out of your schedule to spend this with us. So appreciate it, and thanks for joining me.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks, Owen.
Thanks for watching this episode of the podcast. If you want to hear more from us, you can get daily videos and podcasts on RAS YouTube channel, Or if you want to enroll in a free course on investing, property, business, money, you name it, you can join over 34,000 other students and enroll in a free course on the Rask website. Simply head to www.rask.com.au and follow the prompts. Thanks for watching this Rask podcast.